The libdem conference has just finished, and Sir Ed Davey's speech in Brighton is a triumphal reflection on the party's most recent electoral success. But beneath the optimism lie challenges for their future strategy. And Davey's focus on the NHS, social care, attacks on the Tories signals where the party sees its political niche, but there are also reasons to question whether this approach will be sustainable or efficacious in the longer term. First of all, this was all about a victory lap and gratitude for the votes. The Lib Dems have not done so well since the collapse of the party in the early part of the 20th century. And Davey effectively becomes the most successful leader since Asquith and Lloyd George. Asquith, very interesting book, by the way, about by Harris, which what's it called? It's called. I'm reading it at the moment. I can't remember the title. It's got a pile of stairs on the front. It's about a lady called Venetia, who's having a bit of whoopsie with the Prime Minister, and as World War I breaks out. Anyway. So Ed Davey took the opportunity to thank those involved in the party for the party's triumphs and acknowledge the contributions of past leaders such as Charles Kennedy and Paddy Ashdown. And this moment of reflection was necessary to rally party morale, but it also risked looking inward rather than forward. And his focus on the NHS and social care, speaking about winter-proofing the NHS, emphasising his personal connection to the issue through his own disabled son. This is a heartfelt appeal aimed at securing support from voters on both sides of the political spectrum, and the NHS remains a key battleground for all parties. And by making it central to the Lib Dem platform, Davey hopes to find a unifying cause that resonates across social divisions. But it's not enough just simply to pump out the rhetoric, because the NHS needs money and it needs reorganisation and it needs to be trimmed of the nonsensical bureaucracy at the top. And so you need somebody with a significant power to take a sword and, or a needle and prick the importance of the people sitting in, as CEOs of the large NHS trusts, because they need to go. His attack on the Conservatives, despite them being in opposition, and this is what came across as so odd, he spent much of his speech targeting their failures, calling them totally unfit to govern. Well, they aren't governing at the moment. Unfit for opposition. Well, I agree about that. And his tactic capitalises on voter frustration with the last government, particularly in the blue wall seats where the Lib Dems have made gains. So what's he going to say? That by the next election, his Lib Dems will be big enough to take on the role of opposition? I'm afraid that's rather like saying to a child before the GCSEs, if you try really hard, you might get a lower grade. You've got to set your sights on the top. And setting his sights on pulling down number 2 is not enough. It's not enough. And he is setting himself up for failure. The Lib Dems as the reasonable opposition is something that, frankly, is understood, and he doesn't need to. I don't think he needs to say it. As a necessary and constructive opposition, implying that the Conservatives are too fragmented to hold the government to account, yes, absolutely. And this idea, while politically sharp, loses its potency as the Conservative Party adjusts to opposition and begins to rebuild its appeal. He's got a very limited amount of time to refashion his rhetoric to take on that role and be seen by the electorate as the natural opposition to the Labour Party. And of course, a lot of the speech was loaded with jokes, some well received, others not, adding levity to his address. But while humour can soften a political message, over-reliance on light-heartedness undermines the seriousness of the challenges ahead, especially when contrasted with the gravitas of national crisis and international crisis. His overemphasis on past victories makes him look complacent, and the Lib Dems' future will be defined by their ability to adapt to a changing landscape, not by dwelling on past achievements. A victory lap is appropriate after July's results, yes, but indulging it risks a sort of self-obsession that echoes that of the Conservative Party. And his NHS-centric approach actually has limited appeal. Although it's a cross-party issue, it's historically been Labour's stronghold. Labour's in power. Labour is not going to, it needs to be held to account. But I don't think that Davey is in a position to carve out a space in this domain to differentiate the Lib Dems from Labour, especially with Labour now in government. Furthermore, focusing on the NHS neglects other pressing voter concerns like the economy, climate change, housing, where the Lib Dems could establish more distinct, innovative policies. And the attack on the Conservatives, I think it was too much too soon. His relentless attacks on the present Conservative Party, which is now in opposition, it feels hollow and irrelevant, and will feel more hollow and more relevant as time. The party conference is a showcase of where the party is going to go over the next year. Focusing on the Conservative Party's failures is simply an election campaign, and he's not moved the argument forward. And what instead I think he's got to do is fulfill the voters' expectations of the Lib Dems taking on the role of being a constructive opposition. And that means more than rhetorical attacks and humour. So while casting the party as a responsible opposition, which is an important thing to do, he needs to back this up with substantial policy proposals, a clear alternative vision to Labour's agenda, and relying too heavy on Tory bashing or vague commitments to the NHS will see the party's support plateau drop off rather than grow. And he's got to build slightly more than just a plateau. He's got to build a little peak. And I think it's looking more like Professor Challenger discovering dinosaurs in the lost world rather than building up to some sort of ascent of Everest. And there's a long way to go. And he risks alienating potential coalition partners, because the only way forward for the Lib Dem really is in coalition, and his combative tone towards the Conservatives makes the possibility of a future coalition there impossible, especially in the event of another hung parliament. And the Lib Dems' traditional role as kingmakers will be undermined if they're seen as too antagonistic towards one party or the other, a lesson learned painfully from the 2010 coalition experience. So his speech in Brighton was undoubtedly a moment of celebration, and he deserves that, but its long-term impact will be limited by his overemphasis on past victories, his predictable attacks, which sound like more electioneering, and his failure to produce one single quote that is memorable. Can you remember anything he said? I can't. There's no single phrase, quotation, slogan. I know I say I don't really like slogans, but, there are times when I think a little bit of a slogan might not go amiss. The Lib Dems have none. Courtesy of Sir Ed Davey, no slogans at all. Just a lot of rhetoric, clapping, and some giggles. That's not a good party political closing speech, is it?